Hey there, banditos. Welcome to a brand new episode for a brand new week. I am Joe Marcello.
I'm Oren Phillips.
And this week on the Dollar Bin Bandits, we're bringing you an absolutely interesting and, for me, very educational episode. And it is Oren's interview with none other than Cy Barry. Cy has a really interesting career, as do all of our guests, really. But he is really the man behind the Phantom. And we even have a special guest interviewing him.
We were lucky to tag in our longtime friend, Mr. Bob Kroll. Bob and his dad were both huge Phantom fans. So when this opportunity arose, he was the right guy to come in. It was a wonderful treat to work with him. As far as Cy Barry goes, I mean, you talk about living legends. I believe he's 93 years old. He worked for Timely Comics and Atlas before they became Marvel and DC. He's name drops Siegel and Schuster about going out to lunch with them. This is a man who lived comic book history and is a part of comic book history with his incredible work on the Phantom. So I hope you guys enjoy this. We love speaking to him, and we present Mr. Cy Barry. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us this evening. It's truly an honor for Bob and myself.
It's my pleasure.
My first question was, how did you get influenced into getting into the field of comics?
Actually, I studied illustration in high school. It was an art high school in New York. And my first year, I began studying illustration. And by the second year of high school, I had realized that my brother Dan, who was 5 years older than me, he was in the Army at the time. He was in the service overseas in the Pacific, and he was doing some comic book work. He'd been doing comic book work before he went into the service, and he broke in when he was about 16 into comics. And by the time he was 19 or 20, he went into the service. And while he was there, he was working on Stars and Stripes, and which is one of the service magazines. And he was also doing other things in the way of writing and doing Army military propaganda that was being done at the time. They were doing films about the military and very patriotic flag waving kind of stuff, you know, to keep the spirits up. And Dan was involved in some of that artwork. And he was also doing a little bit of comics while he was on his spare time. He was actually in the Signal Corps. He wasn't carrying a gun or fighting out on the field, but his work was very important. They were able to break a couple of codes, and they used, as a matter of fact, they used Native American language to communicate, and neither the Germans nor the Japanese understood what it was all about. So we had some wonderful devices to to be secretive from our enemy, and Dan was involved in that. And then when I got out of high school, or actually a year before I got out of high school, I did a few things for a couple of comic book publishers. One of them was Famous Funnies, my very first page that I did. It was a filler page. And then I began working for another outfit called Quality Comics. These are out of commission. They've been out of commission for many years, but they were pretty popular in their time. And when I got out of school, I began working with Dan. I worked on Tarzan with him. We did the daily Tarzan while Bernie Hogarth was doing the Sunday, and which he took over from another artist back in the 30s. He took the artwork over from another artist, and I started working, starting to go around to different publishers, and I finally got a little work from DC. I began inking for them, and later on I began to pencil and ink, and then I got into the romance. I did mostly adventure work. I also ate other artists' work like Gil Kane and Alex Toth's work, and a Swan who did the Superman. So I worked on Superman. I also ate Batman's work, and I did one pencil story of Batman. I worked on Johnny Thunder and many features for DC. And at the time, Stan Lee called me and asked me to do something. At that time, it was called, his company was called not Marvel, Timely Comics, and then they changed the name to Marvel. But I think his uncle owned the company, Goodman, I think his name was, and he had this habit of putting loading the market with books, and he would publish like 60 books at a time, which was overwhelming. DC never even dared to do something like that. They were a much more conservative company. And of course, many of them wouldn't sell, and they would go bust and go into a short-term bankruptcy and then start new books again. They're always recovering, but they always had financial problems. It wasn't until after Goodman had passed away that Stan Lee started to begin to take over the production of the books, and he made it very successful. He really did. He, together with Jack Kirby, and then Steve Ditko came in later. This was after I was out of comic books. I was on the strip already when Spidey came up, Spider-Man, and some other characters, the Hulk, and all those characters. They began after I had left comic books, but I saw them being featured, and I began to hear the names of the other artists. But I was much more. I was more in a working position with guys like Alex Toth and Gil Kane and some other pencilers. There was the two guys that worked together. I got to know them, but I got to know all of the DC artists, as well as Jerry Robinson, who had been a primary artist on Batman for quite a while, and he was a marvelous artist. And he's the guy that developed the Joker, Jerry Robinson. He developed that character. So I knew so many of the artists during that golden age, and then the silver age came in. But I was on the Phantom by then, because I guess I started on the Phantom in '61, and those other features didn't get started till the mid '60s, late '60s, early '70s. Yeah.
Now, as a young man in high school, and you see your art in Famous Funnies, how big a deal was it for you to see yourself being published? And
I couldn't believe it. They didn't have my name on it. My name was not allowed to be put on it. In fact, everything I did for DC, my name was not on. It wasn't until later on when they reproduced the originals, because they did keep the originals on some of the work. Then they began to put our names in, the penciler and the inker and whoever did the complete job. There were times that they did a full job of penciling and inking. Gil Kane never inked his work. All his work was inked by either Joe Giella or me. Joe Giella worked on Batman as well, and he did a lot of work with me on the Phantom, and he helped me out to get ahead on my schedule and my deadlines. So we were good buddies. As a matter of fact, Joe Giella was one of the guys that went to school with me. We were in the same class, Joe Giella and I, and I still am in touch with him. I just called him to wish him a happy new year. He's just my age. He's like three months younger than me. So to me, he's a kid. you know. And but we had a wonderful relationship, and we still have a very good relationship. We're still friends since we were 15 years old. So that's like 80 years now that we've been friends.
God bless.
Quite a friendship. We had two other guys who we were very close with, and they're gone now. That also went to SIA too, to School of Industrial Art. Yeah. So that's when I did see my work. You asked me about when I first saw my work and saw Famous Funnies. It was such a thrill for me. I didn't do the coloring on it. I mean, they did a pretty nice job on the coloring, so I was very impressed. Very impressed.
Now, Stan Lee famously has said that he would never admit to people that he worked in comic books until, Marvel started to get big. He would say that he, worked in newspapers, something like that. Did you guys?
Really?
Yeah. Did you guys admit that you worked in comic books? Because he sort of made it seem like it was.
I was not ashamed of working in comic books. Not at all. I was proud. I always felt that it needed much more publicity, and it needed to be relegated to a better standard, to a better concept, and it needed to be promoted as a form of art. It was scorned at one time. I mean, you could remember probably in your when you were in school, in high school, junior high school, whatever. I'm sure that you were restricted from bringing comic books in. In fact, there were a couple of newspapers that we were not allowed to bring in, such as in New York, the Daily Mirror and the Daily News. We were not allowed to. We could bring in the Times or the Wall Street Journal. So mostly because they were comics, and we would always be reading the comics in those newspapers. And teachers scorned it. They all scorned our reading those papers.
Wow. Yeah.
So excuse me, I'm sipping my coffee.
Not a problem.
All right. So we felt that the standards needed to be, or I should say, the attitude of comic books was very poor, and it needed to be relegated into a better position and looked at with more respect. And we did. We out of the National Cartoonist Society began to recognize comic. Most of the work that was considered that they did their judging on every year were either spot cartoons or editorial cartoons or comic strips. And we were comic books were like the last area of judgment that was being considered at the time, even by the Cartoonist Society. And we began to bring up the point that we need more respect. We were the beginning of Rodney Dangerfield. We needed more respect, and so the president and the vice president and they set up a committee to try to give comic books more support and more publicity. It needed more publicity, and it began to work. I'd say in the 70s, we were starting to get just a little more recognition. And by the 90s, the best stories were coming out of comic books, the best features. So at Marvel and DC, there was a period during the 50s before I got onto the Phantom, but that I was very, very angry and disappointed with comic books. And that was the period when they were producing horror work. The gore and horror, bodies melting and skin and bones being shown, and it was just ugly stuff, really ugly stuff. And I vowed that I would never do any of those horror stories. That's when I got into romance. I switched from adventure into romance work, and that kept me in a safe category. So I wasn't asked to do horror work, and I was very happy avoiding it. And that's when when Congress the house began to bear down on comic books, and they set up a commission that checked every story that was produced to make sure that ugly stuff was not produced. And I was glad that it was being. We thought it was an intrusion, but on the other hand, I was glad it was being done because I didn't want kids. I didn't want. I mean, my kids were older by then, but I didn't want younger kids reading that kind of stuff. It was awful. No, as a matter of fact, this was in the late 50s. David wasn't born yet. I'm sorry. No, they were pretty young at the time, and I didn't want my two girls before David was born to be reading that stuff. Right. But then they liked the romance stuff anyway, so I was glad I was doing it. Yeah.
So I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit if that's all right. Just because of how you wanted comics to have a little bit more respectability, especially, which I'm always for. Did this lead to the Martin Luther King comic that you worked on at all, or is that
that had no influence at all, because that was more of a commercial thing I did for the education system. This was produced for the education system for children in schools. It was distributed to all the schools around, except in the South, because schools were not allowed to accept it according to their state laws. They were not accepting Martin Luther King at the time. He was just an upcoming young pain in the neck to the Southern the Southern system and their attitude. And he was scorned, of course. And even J. Edgar Hoover distrusted him, thought he was a communist stirring up trouble. You know, Hoover was an awful individual. He had a lot of power, and he dictated to the presidents what was allowed and what wasn't. He had a tremendous amount of power, and I was glad when he was finally taken out of office. But Martin Luther King, the story of Martin Luther King, was presented to me, or the opportunity to do the story of Martin Luther King, by I guess you remember Al Cap, who did Lil Abner, right? Well, his brother Elliot Kaplan, he was a writer, a comic book writer, and he wrote comic strips, I should say. He wrote Heart of Julia Jones, and he did work with Al Cap on his strip, but he wrote a few. He wrote Big Ben Bolt, which was a boxing strip. And he was a brilliant writer, really. And he was the guy that called me, not Al Cap, but his brother Elliot Kaplan called me. He said, "How do I feel?" Asked me, "How do I feel about Martin Luther King?" And this is around 56, 57. I think we're around then. And I said, "Well, I admire what he's doing." I said, "I thought, especially since J. Edgar Hoover doesn't like him, I really like him because Hoover doesn't like him." So I said, "But what I'm worried about is I hope that this guy lives a long life, because I think he's stirring up enough trouble down in the South that something serious could happen to him. You know, I just hope he lives a long life." And it was almost like an omen when I said that to Elliot. And Elliot said, "Well, good." He said, "I'm going to send you some script." He said, "I'll send you a few pages of script and see what you think of it. If you don't like how it's written, or if you don't like the concept, and you feel a little worried about doing it or whatever, let me know, and we can just call it off." When I read it, it was beautifully written, very nicely done, and very well chronologically. It was just read beautifully, and it was just a few pages, so I wanted to read more, because of the way he wrote it. And that's when I got onto it, and I loved working on it. I think it was maybe 20 pages or something like that. I'm not sure how many pages, but I enjoyed working, and I also did the coloring on it too.
Yeah, it's really good. I really enjoyed it, and I tried to pass it
I
around.
love working on it. Yeah.
Yeah, very good. Cool. Thank you.
I also had to do a couple of the characters, like his very close friend, something with an R. I forgot his name, but there were a couple of pastors and a Young. What was his name? His last name was Young. Andrew Young. Andrew Young. He became. I think he became a representative at one point, and he worked. He also had elected office in his state. He was very prominent in the Martin Luther Drive. He was very heavily involved in the walk and in Selma, Alabama, and all of that. Yeah, Montgomery. That was a terrible state. Terrible state. They brutalized the movement, really.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I did enjoy it. And the funny thing is, the reason I hadn't seen that book in production because I was back in the 50s. And then I was at a comic convention at one of my booths. And I was there with David and selling my stuff, my originals and what have you. And one guy comes up and he presents this book to me. And what is it? It's the booklet of Martin Luther King. I hadn't seen it for like 25 years. And he said, were you the artist that did this? He said, it looks so much like your work. How this guy recognized this style as compared to the style I use on the Phantom, it just amazed me because it was slightly a little bit different than the way I drew the Phantom. It had a little less flax to it than the Phantom and a little less drama to it. So I said, well, how did you notice that? I said, how did you even notice that it was my style? He said, is it really yours? I said, yeah, it is. I did it back in the mid 50s. Well, he was amazed. So he said, I have to get back and I have to tell my past teachers, and I have to tell a lot of my friends who love the Phantom. There's something up here about family album. So he was just amazed. When I saw that, I told my granddaughter about it. Of course, I told David, but my granddaughter, while I was telling this story, she's working on her phone, and she said, I just bought one for you. I just bought an issue for you. I don't know how she got onto it, how she found the link or how she did it. But while I was talking to her, telling the story about this guy talking to me at the Comic-Con, and she said, I sure enough, about a week later, I got the issue. But the thing was that when I did it, it had my name on it. They took my name off. It's been reproduced 2 or 3 times since I did it. The original issue has been reproduced 2 or 3 times. By the 3rd or 4th time, it was starting to get a little muddy. They needed the new photos of the originals, which I'm sure Al Cap had the originals. I don't know whatever happened to them. I would have loved to get them back. They're probably worth a great deal.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, in fact, I would love to see it just on display somewhere in the internet. I would love to see them again.
Yeah. Oh, Oren, we got our next mission ahead of us.
Okay. Okay, maybe you guys can seek it out. Okay.
Well, now going right to the Phantom though. You started in the early 1960s. What did you like drawing most in the Phantom? Like did something ever come down? It's like, yeah, that's the thing I like to draw the most.
Oh, okay. First of all, when I started in 61, there's just something I wanted to tell you. The first week of work I did, the first week of dailies, they called me after I delivered it, and they said, "Cy, the work is beautiful, but it looks like Flash Gordon, and it does not look like Wilson McCoy's work." And they said, yeah, really, you're going to have to do the work over again. He said, they said, because the editors are they're going to be in shock when they see the difference from 1 week to the next between McCoy's work and my work. It was so distinctly different. So I said, you mean I have to work in that style? To me, it was so academic. The drawing was so academic, so weakly drawn, And I always said I would love someday to draw the Phantom. I would give it so much action and drama, and more blacks in there, and more expression, And sure enough, they were giving me the opportunity. But I had to draw like Wilson McCoy, so I had to kind of reduce my thinking more simplistically. And it's very hard to do, breaking away from your own style and trying to do something in a very simplistic style. It's very hard, and still have it look somewhat decent. So I did a few weeks, and little by little, I began to get more blacks into it, began to change the character of the put more muscles on the Phantom, making him a little more distinct, getting more dramatic shots into it, and of course, getting the drama and putting more expression. The Phantom was a stone face. I mean, every face that Wilson McCoy drew had the same expression, like that. Even when he was talking, he was like a stone. And I began to give him some expression when he was angry, when he was sad, all of the different expressions, and make him be a human being, not just a stone. So I think that's what my fans began to, I don't think they recognize it, but I think they began to recognize the fact that it became more human and more alive. It wasn't just a picture. It was a person. It was a person who had expressions and emotions. So that, I think that, and also I put it into the characters that he dealt with. I put a lot of emotion into them. So it became more human. The strip became more human.
Yeah, it's very visible. I even noticed that.
I don't know if you agree with my feeling about it, whether I came across showing it, whether the reader recognized it or not.
Oh yeah, I was reading it literally at lunch today. Like, yeah, this is a cut above, and I'm not just saying that. It's like this is.
I'm glad. I'm glad, because we put a lot of work into it. A lot of reference material. I love doing animals. That was one of my favorite subjects to work on, and you could see how I made the animals, a little more dynamic than just standing there or sitting there.
Oh, yeah.
When they were in action, I try to really put action into it.
Mission accomplished. You did very well.
Thank you. I'm glad I accomplished it.
How many issues do you think it took for you to finally put your own spin and your own style?
Oh, I'd say when I was able to do it completely my own style, I'd say a couple of months.
Okay.
A couple of months, not too long.
Now,
as long as the editor began to see a little bit of the similarity in the beginning,
right?
Even though it was still, my drawing was still different, but it had those more simplicity, didn't have the deep black, the strong blacks in it. But week by week, I began to add more into it. I began to change the dog. The dog was nondescript, that McCoy did. I think you remember it. Just had no definitive effect to it. There was nothing definitive. I sort of put the black coat on his back and make him look a little more like a cross between the wolf and a German Shepherd, So little by little, he became more of a wolf.
And how involved was Lee Falk with you and your art? Was he looking it over, or was he sort of doing his own thing at the time?
For some foolish reason, Lee Falk always felt like he was competing against me.
Oh, geez.
No, I had not. I mean, he knew my artwork was good, and he knew it. And I think he knew that my artwork would become more recognized than his writing.
Okay.
All right. And there was a certain insecurity about him. I mean, he dealt with people with an air of superiority. You know, he did that. But there was a certain hidden insecurity because he did things to try to diminish my stature on the strip. He did a lot of little things that pecked away at my popularity, you know, and it was always a conflict between he and I. And I would have some of the most bitter arguments that my wife would just pull me away from the phone and say, either you stop talking on the phone or she said, I'm going to hang it up, because she would see I would get so annoyed with him, so angry at him. I would have such bitter arguments with him about what he was trying to do to diminish my stature on the strip. And he always told everyone, I mean, falsely, he told everyone I was his assistant. And I said, you know, I was so angry at this because, you know, I had my own position on the strip. I was the artist. I was paid separately. He didn't pay me. I didn't work for him. I would never work for him either. I would never take a job with him. He wasn't the kind of person I could deal with. I had one difficult personality that I had to deal with, and that was my brother. I didn't want two of them, you know. But I did have a lot of conflicts with him, I must say. I respected him enormously, I must say, as a writer. He was he had a wonderful concept, both for Mandrake and the Phantom. I think his concept on the Phantom is what kept the Phantom going for so many years. The idea of it being an adventure strip and at the same time a fantasy strip. That bit of fantasy is what kept it novel. It kept it as a novel strip. It was something different, a little unusual. And he didn't have superpowers. He was a normal human being who's a little stronger than the next guy, you know. But he was human. He was human.
Yeah. And just a quick follow-up on that. Were there any writers you had an excellent rapport with who you really, it worked so well together that it was just a wonderful union?
I rarely dealt with writers. I really did. I would get scripts from writers, and the editor would tell me who wrote the script. But I didn't have personal dealings with them. Most of the artists. I did go out to lunch a couple of times with Jerry Siegel, with Siegel and Schuster of Superman. I went out to lunch a couple of times with him. I did meet Joe Schuster in their office. And Joe was beginning to go blind at that time, Joe Schuster, until he finally couldn't do any artwork at all. And that was a pretty sad tragedy. And they were lured into a suit against DC with a lawyer who didn't know what he was doing. And they probably should not have handled their suit the way they did. They came on too strong and expected too much at one time. I think they had to gradually begin to chip away at and get more for themselves. At one point, they were only being given a salary. They didn't have any ownership on the strip. And the lawyer who lured them into suing asked too much at one time and clinged to that. He didn't adjust to make any concessions or anything. And they failed, and they wound up having nothing. Whatever Jerry Siegel was writing for Superman, he was getting paid a small percentage on it, and they compensated Joe Schuster. He was going blind; he couldn't work anymore, and they compensated him some kind of like an unemployment compensation kind of thing, you know. So he made an annual salary from them, which was nice of them. But on the other hand, they stole the strip from these two guys. Yeah. They took ownership of something that I mean, intellectual property was not even considered at that time. No one even considered it. Nobody even considered suing for it. If you came up with a character, I mean, they owned the character, and you made a salary on it. I think one guy, maybe Bob Kane, was able to work out a percentage deal with them for Superman, for Batman. But that's how things were those days.
Oh, wow. Heavy stuff. Now perhaps getting into one of my dad's favorite words of all time, retirement.
Yeah,
I was
okay. His favorite words.
Yeah, that was one of his favorite words.
Yeah, what did your dad do?
Dad was a high school teacher, or really K through 12. He did it all.
I had a lot of respect for a few of my high school teachers. I still, yeah. Go ahead.
So he would say retirement was every day feels like Saturday except Sunday. You retired from the the Phantom in 1994. What made you decide to hang up the spurs, so to speak? Like it's time to leave the jungle.
Okay. Yeah, right. I like that. To leave the jungle. I began to enjoy painting. In fact, I had started painting about 10 years before, and I would start and stop and get very busy with the strip, and then I would get back to I'd have to buy some new paints because my old paints were drying up. So I was trying my hand at it, and I was kind of self-teaching, and then I began to take a couple of courses with a couple of professional teachers, and they were very good. And the more I began to get into it, the more I began to enjoy it. So that was the one driving issue that made me decide to leave the strip. That, but more importantly, I was kind of hitting a wall at one point. My creative juices were just, I just felt like I did everything I could do. Oh, I think I'm losing you. Oh, there you are. Okay. I felt like I had done everything I could do on the strip. I was having more and more difficulty getting script from Lee Falk and keeping ahead with the schedule. I was fighting with him all the time. And then I finally had to go to the managing editor who didn't have very much power over Lee Falk. So he would say, he would kind of placate me. He'd say, okay, Si, I'll talk to him, but nothing ever happened. So I said, I'm just not getting anywhere, and I'm tired of fighting him, and I'm more anxious to get into painting. And I've made my money, and I've done nicely, and I was ready to financially, I was ready to retire, and I think I had everything going for me to retire. I just felt like I had spent enough years, and I wanted to do something. And another reason is socially, I wanted to get into socializing and doing more with my wife and spending more time with my family. Those were the driving forces.
Yeah. Good driving forces.
They were pretty strong. Right.
You had mentioned him earlier, and I just wanted to get your thoughts and opinions on Bob Kane. I know he could be a bit of a polarizing figure. What were your opinions on him?
I never knew him.
Okay.
I met him once up at DC, but I never really knew him, never really got to talk to him personally. Many times I'd go out to lunch with these guys, with Alex and with Gil and especially with Joe. I'd meet Joe quite often in the city. But I never got to meet Bob Kane. I did meet as I said, I met Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster. I met them. I went out to lunch a couple of times with Jerry. But I never got to meet Bob Kane. So I never knew what kind of person I understood he was a very strong, egotistic individual. Most of these guys who come up with ideas and do well seem to turn to, they kind of, adore themselves a great deal,
So,
but I did hear he's that kind of personality. You're a very, very strong, egotistic guy. Yeah.
Oh, that's probably also why Jim Steranko slapped him across the face at that one convention.
What? What happened at a convention?
Oh, Jim Steranko slapped Bob Kane across the face at a convention once.
Really?
So
Okay, right.
this seems to this all makes a lot of sense. But maybe on a more positive note, you brought up Gil Kane. I gotta ask this: how was he? How was working with him?
Okay. I didn't really work with him, but I would see him up at DC. I went out to lunch a couple of times with him. A very loquacious guy. He very hard to get 2 words in while he's talking. Okay. And it's so funny because I remember one occasion where we went out, Joe Giella and I and Gil Kane went out to lunch and we're sitting there, and Joe is sitting next to me, and we're sitting in a booth, and Gil is sitting opposite us. So he had the opportunity to see us both and talk all the time. Okay. When he finally stopped, because the food had arrived, when he finally stopped talking so that he could start to eat his food, Joe said, "You know something, Gil? You're full of shit." And then this is after a half hour of talking about art and what he needs to do to improve his work, and what comics needs to do to be in a better position and to improve its standards and all of that. There's this long, loquacious essay to us, and this one comment from Joe. Well, I was drinking coffee and I spread it. When he said it, I was just something. He always managed to say something just at the time when I'm drinking coffee. Oh my God. So, I mean, I just broke up when he said that. Well, so Gil looks at him, he said, he didn't know how to take it. He never heard anybody say this to him. Everybody would kind of agree or disagree, and they would debate with it. But to say something so raw and so down to earth, oh my God, that was Joe. He was a funny guy.
Oh man. Were there any characters that you wish you had a chance to work on beyond Phantom or anybody else?
Beyond the Phantom?
Or Batman, beyond any of those?
There was one character that Dan worked on. Somebody developed, one of the writers developed this character for DC, and he was called the Vigilante. He rode on a motorcycle. Do you know the character at all?
Yeah.
Yeah. Both of you are familiar with it?
Yeah, he was like a cowboy, but on a motorcycle.
Cowboy, that's right.
Yeah.
He wore a blue cowboy shirt with a white hat. And, yeah, right. And he had a rope, as a matter of fact, like if you would carry a rope on a horse. And a great character. I loved his uniform. I loved his costume that he wore, and with the boots and everything. It was a great character. And there were times when he'd wear the bandana around his face. He was a great character, and I just loved working on the motorcycle too, doing the motorcycle. And there were a couple. In fact, there was one story that I did a part of the penciling with Dan. Dan penciled it, and I penciled part of it, and then we both inked it, and we rushed the story out because he was working on another project, and this story was getting late. He was starting to be late. So I did a little more on it than I usually do, working with Dan. So that was one of the characters that I liked. I did like one of the characters that Carmine did, the guy in the black coat. He was kind of reminded me of the Spirit, but he wore a coat instead, and a black
Stranger?
hat. Huh?
Phantom Stranger.
Phantom Stranger. That's it. Yep, that's it. As a matter of fact, maybe that's why I liked it, because I had the Phantom name in it. But it was a good character. I liked the character, and Johnny Thunder too.
Yep.
Johnny Thunder too. Yeah.
Did you prefer penciling or inking if you had your druthers?
There was a time when I enjoyed inking more, but then the more I penciled, the more I liked it.
Okay.
And I must say they were probably about equal. When I penciled for myself, if I penciled for someone to ink my stuff, I would pencil it tighter. But it gave me a better opportunity to get onto the next story, the next week of work when somebody inked the previous set of pencils. But to get, but the more I penciled, the less pencils I had to put into it because I would do a lot of my drawing with my inking. So because I was able to draw with my brush and my pen, I just did less final finished work on my pencils, far less finished. Yeah.
And
But I like both. I like both, really.
okay. So you had your brother working on Flash Gordon. You're
Yeah.
working on the Phantom. You said
Yeah.
before you both worked on Tarzan. Well, do you ever think back on the influence that you guys had and your impact on comic history?
Yes, I did. I always did think about it. When I retired, I had before I retired, I used to work at my drawing board and I would spend 6 days a week at the drawing board and sometimes a little bit of the seventh day. And I would socialize on the weekends. And during the week, I'd be locked in my room and I'd come out and just spend a little time with the family and have my meals and then work late at night. And I did spend much time socializing during the week. And it wasn't until the weekends that I would socialize a little bit. But I didn't know what was going on out in the world, that my work was being read by so many millions of people throughout the world. Yeah. It wasn't until after I retired and I went to my first Comic-Con, and that was in Australia. And the hundreds of people lined up to have me sign their work. I was absolutely floored by the amount of people waiting online, and each one wanted to talk to me. And here there were people going way back, out into the hallway. And I had no idea that there were so many people that loved my work. And then they told me, oh, well, your work is not only here in Australia, it's in New Zealand, it's in the Scandinavian countries, it's even bigger there. It's in Brazil, it's in South America, it's in India. I had no idea that it's sold in that many papers and so many millions of people read the strip. It wasn't until I really retired and began to travel that I began to find out how many clubs there are that were developed in interest of the Phantom and Side Barry this and Side Barry that. I had no idea that it was that extensive in its popularity.
Yeah, a friend of mine in Sweden actually sent me a few Phantom albums, and you're definitely on display even in the past couple of years too.
That's what amazes me. I'm retired almost 30 years, and there are still so many fans out there that still recognize my work. I'm very grateful for it. Very grateful.
Yeah, and I remembered also the Phantom shows up on shields by the people in Papua New Guinea in the 60s through the 80s. So that's real influence there. I think we're going to be starting to wrap things up because keeping it in the family. Did you ever speak with your brother like, hey, maybe we need to talk to the powers that be? Maybe we need to have Flash and Phantom team up somehow or try to push that? Nah.
No. It's sad, but I'm revealing this. My relationship with Dan was not very good. Not through my not through my efforts, or I should say my efforts to stay friendly with him were always there. I always try to stay friendly with him. And there were many things that he did that that hurt me personally. And even then, I would be angry, and then I would make up with him, and things would continue. We did not have a very good relationship, and it was not through my design, really. I must say that Dan, once I got onto the strip, and I no longer was available to help him in his moments of crisis, he began to see that I was becoming a little more popular than he was, a lot more popular, because the Phantom was selling far better than Flash Gordon was. Besides which, he was on a salary and I was on a percentage. And my percentage on the strip was much more favorable than what he was making as in a salary. So his jealousy was uncontrollable. And he did everything he could to try to, he and Lee Falk, the two of them, were doing everything they could to try to diminish my popularity or my efforts on the strip. And because he was so jealous of my standard, of my position on the strip, he took it personally. And he made every effort to put me down. He demeaned me and it demeaned my personal family. And the more things he did, the more separated I became from him. The more it cut the ties, till eventually that we spent many years just not talking to each other. And there were attempts on my part to try to talk to him again. And he refused to talk to me. And this went on for quite a few years until he became ill. He had moved to Cleveland, Georgia. He moved to Georgia and did his work there. And he had already been off Flash Gordon at that point. This was in the early 90s. He had been off Flash Gordon, and I had just retired. That's right. So it was a midnight. I retired in 94, and it was about a year or two. So it was around 96 that he passed. He developed cancer, and I went there with my sister to visit him. And even then, he received me very coldly. I traveled all the way down to Georgia to see him, and took my sister down there and spent a couple of days there. And just the effort of going down there, he should have at least acknowledged the fact that I went out of my way to visit him. And the moment I got there, he was still angry at me. And the first thing he said to me is, "How come you didn't recommend me to do the strip?" Now he was ill by that time already. He was getting ill. He was supposed to stop smoking. He never stopped smoking. He was told that he had cancer 2 years before, and he thought he was on remission at one point. So he started smoking again, and he never stopped. And to the day he died, he still has a cigarette in his mouth. After I saw him, we did leave on good terms. We embraced, and at least I was glad for that I went down there and that I changed his attitude towards me, and he felt that I did something nice by coming down there. And so we left on good terms, and about a week and a half later, he died. So, but I was glad that I went down there. I felt I had to do it, even though I was angry at him and he was angry at me. I felt it was something I personally had to do for myself, so that it was a last gesture before he died. I had seen all my other siblings before they died, and I didn't want to skip seeing him. Even he was in a bad state at the time, and I felt too much of a brotherly attraction to him to not want to see him again. So I'm glad I did it. I carry it with me that I'm glad I did that.
I hope it didn't dredge up any bad memories for you.
As a result, once I got the strip for 33 years, he was always showing signs of jealousy and anger and just a not a very healthy relationship. It was sad, and all through his own jealousy and sad and anger, his own bitterness. He was always a bitter guy, and I there was no changing it either.
Yeah. Well,
It was sad.
yeah,
And he was a brilliant guy too.
Yeah.
He was very brilliant, and I mean, if he had had a different emotional attitude, if it was a different kind of personality, he could have been extremely successful. He could have been successful at anything he did. That's how bright he was. Really.
on a somewhat lighter note, just one last question is, last month at Big Apple Comic-Con, you were guest of honor. How was that experience being back in the city, and fans are so happy to see you?
Yeah, we were just there last month.
Yep.
Yeah, and I loved it. Oh, it was so nice. I mean, just seeing all those people that were there and bringing their things to be signed, and purchasing some of my artwork, and still knowing that I'm still being recognized. It was a tremendous thrill. It really is. Each time I go to a Comic-Con, it's getting more difficult physically for me to do it now, you know. But I love it. Once I'm there, I love it. And I love seeing people. I always enjoyed being with people. But if not for David, really, I never could have made it to this last Comic-Con. He did everything. He had everything set up before I even got down there. All I had to do was shower and dress and have a little snack for breakfast, and everything was there. Everything was ready. Everything was laid out. Everything was up on the wall, and our backdrop was up, and it was just wonderful. I don't know if you saw any pictures from it at all.
Yeah.
Oh, you did?
It looked like a wonderful time. Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I really enjoyed it. So did David.
And the fans
Yeah.
enjoyed seeing you, and that's a big thing for them.
Yeah, I'll tell you, we make a good partnership, David and I, because he's very capable of getting things set up.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, sir, again, thank you so much for taking the time. And as two fans right here, thank you for
Right.
all you've done for us in the comic world, the comic community.
I'm so happy that there are two guys that still remember some of the earlier work I did and some of the things that I was involved in comic books. It's nice to know that you bothered enough to follow some of my history and my background. I really appreciate it. I'm very grateful.
Absolutely.
Right.
We're absolutely.
Right. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much.
Right. Wonderful.
And we're back. Fantastic educational and historic interview, Oren. You and Bob did an absolutely great job. Phantom is really cool. I only really began to appreciate the Phantom after the terrible movie, because I was like, well, where did this come from? And then you kind of get into it and you realize how far reaching this character is overseas, more so than here. But it really is just, you know, for its, dare I say, simplicity, just so interesting.
And we've been lucky. We've had Keith Williams, who worked on the Phantoms, Mike Manley, who's worked on the Phantoms, and now Cy Barry, the man who pretty much set the tone for the books to come. Very candid about his relationship with Lee Falk, the creator of the Phantom. Was a bit adversarial, but you know, they made the best out of it, and they were successful. And again, truly an honor to speak to this gentleman. So many stories, so many things he's experienced. Recently in October, he was the guest of honor at New York Big Apple Comic-Con, I should say. So he was so pleased about that. So thank you, Mr. Barry. Thank you guys for listening. Remember to rate, review, subscribe, and we'll see you next time.